Good day, everybody. I hope that you are well, and I also hope that you are having a good day so far. Today, we'll be doing our grade 2 English lesson on adjectives and adverbs. And before we start, we're going to log on to aplusstudent.ca, the username as well as our password, select the subject of language arts, grade 2, and then we're going to scroll down up until we get to the chapter of adjectives and adverbs. So our chapter is adjectives and adverbs. Our subject is English language arts. Grade 2, and the lessons that we are going to be focusing on is to choose between adjectives and adverbs, and is the word an adjective or an adverb. So in a previous lesson, we did adverbs, right? And we said an adverb, it is a word that tells us about a verb, an adjective, or another adverb. All right. So we're going to start with our lesson where we say that an adjective is a word that tells us about a noun. So an adjective is a word that tells us about a noun. And an adjective, it tells you what kind, or it tells you how many. So once again, we say an adjective. It is a word that tells us about a noun. And remember, a noun is, for example, people, places, animals, or things, right? That is a noun. It's people, places, animals, or thing. And adjectives, right, they often tell us what kind, or they tell us how many. All right. If we look at an example, right? And the example is Jody saw 3 stars in the sky. So Jody saw 3 stars in the sky. Remember, we said that an adjective, it either tells us what kind or it tells us how many. So if we say Jody saw 3 stars in the sky, right? And then it will basically tell us how many stars Jody saw. And if we were to say how many stars Jody saw, then we would say it is 3 stars that Jody saw. Only 3. So 3 is that number that tells us how many. So basically, our adjective that tells us how many stars Jody saw. All right. So even if we before we continue, it's not even on here, but yes. So how many? 3 stars. So the word three, right? Not necessarily stars, but just three. Three is the adjective that tells us how many. Because even if we were to say how many learners there are, right? Then we say there are, or students, then we say there are 11 students or 10 students watching, right? So there are 10 students watching. So all you're going to do is if we were to identify it, then you would say 10, right? Or underline 10 or identify 10 as the adjective that tells us how many. If we were to count the boys, count the girls, and then we say there are 5 boys, then we only write down 5, right? And sometimes adjectives that tells us how many, it doesn't have to necessarily be a number 1 to 10 or 1 to 100, right? It can also be words like there are several things. So several is our adjective. There are many. So many is our adjective, right? It doesn't necessarily just have to be 1 to 10 or 1 to 100, for example. Right? So well done. Well done. So we have adjectives that tells us about a noun. I made mention a noun can be names of people, places, animals, or things. And adjectives that often tell us what kind or they tell us how many. And we made an example of Jody saw 3 stars. How many stars? 3 stars. And that basically tells us how many stars Jody saw. All right. So now we have an adverb, right? So now we have an adverb. And an adverb is a word that tells you about the verb. So we have an adverb, and an adverb is a word that tells you about a verb. It's the action word, it's a doing word. And adverbs they often tell us how, they tell us when, or they tell us where. So how, when, or where. All right. So here we see that adjectives it often tells us either how, or it tells us when, or it tells us where, right? And an example that we can make is Grace ran quickly. Grace ran quickly. And if we look at that sentence, it says Grace ran quickly. All right. So if we say Grace ran quickly, then it means that we can basically ask ourselves, how did Grace run? Right? So how did Grace run? So we can then say quickly, right? So quickly. And usually when it comes to adverbs, right? The let's say the word that tells us, how things are happening, right? It usually ends in ly. All right. So basically, most of our adverbs, right, they tell us how, and how then ends in ly, right? Like the adverb that says quickly, because now we are basically saying like what Grace did. All right. So we need to still choose between adjectives and adverbs. Remember, an adjective, it tells you about the noun, either the person, place, animal, or thing, right? A noun. And then we have adverbs, right? It is a word that tells you about a verb. So once again, we said our chapter is adjectives and adverb. grade 2, subject English language arts. And the lessons that we are focusing on is to choose between adjectives and adverb, and also is the word an adjective or an adverb. All right, so if we look at the number of learners in my class, we can say, so if we look at the numbers, right, of maybe either learners or students, right, then that can be adjectives that tells us how many, right? If we look at adjectives that tells us what kind, if we were to say, let me do this. I'm going to use a name. If we say Winnie as a beautiful white dress. So if we now were to select our adjective within the sentence, right, and then our adjective is going to be, it's going to be beautiful, and it's going to be white, right? And how do we know if it's beautiful or white? Because that is how we are describing the dress. And in this case, instead of it being how many, we are not saying beautiful and white. It basically tells us what kind of dress is it. It's a beautiful white dress. So what kind is like where we are, it's like we describe or we identify things like color, if it's beautiful or not beautiful, height, length, and so on. Like in this case, Winnie has a beautiful white dress. So beautiful white and dress. That will basically tell us what kind. But if you're going to want a sentence where there's a number in, or they're specifically talking about anything to do with numbers, and then we ask ourselves, how many, right? So when it comes to adjectives, you would basically tell us more about the noun, not the verb, the noun. You describe the noun. And then we once again Musa made an example of adverbs, and we said that adverbs they tell us either how, when, and where. So yes, quickly is our adverb. All right, so let us go to our, we're going to a+students.ca, and then we're going to continue with our tutorial where we are choosing between an adjective and an adverb, right? And we did say that an adjective is a word that tells you about the noun, and they often tell us what kind or how many. That's an adjective, right? And in adverbs, it tells us about the verb, and it often tells us how, when, or where. And if we were to identify, let's say, let's look at the sentence. It says, Gabby uses flour to make her cake. Flour to use a cake. Yes, so in this case, they are saying that Gabby uses fine flours to make a cake, right? So now, fine flours, right? That's an adjective, right? But now it is an adjective that tells us what kind. It's an adjective that tells us what kind of flour, right? And if they ask what kind of flour, then we say, Gabby makes fine flour to make her cakes. The baby cried for her mother. All right. Remember, when we, for example, you need to ask yourself questions like, is it an adjective that tells me what kind, or is it an adjective that tells me how many? And the same with adverbs, right? Is it telling me how? Is it telling me when? Or is it telling me where? Yes. So what kind is correct? Well done. And we just said that an adjective, it tells you about the noun, it tells you what kind as well as how many, right? And if we look at this question at the bottom, it says the word, okay, it says the baby cried for her mother. And here it says the word cried is a verb, so it must be described as an adverb. So we are now still by adjectives, right? And remember adjectives. All right. So what kind? All right. Yes, it says Ellen always drives and carefully. Yes, remember when you're a driver, right? You always need to be vigilant, eyes on the road, which means that you always need to drive safely and carefully. So now this is also one where they say Is it an adjective or is it an adverb? And in this case, remember when they use either a verb, then it's an adverb, right? If they use a noun, then it is an adjective. And in this case, it says Ellen always drives safely and carefully. So how does she drive? She drives safely. All right, so now let's go to our test where we are going to choose between an adjective and an adverb. And before we start, remember an adjective, it tells us about a noun, right? An adjective tells us about a noun. So we need to now choose the best word to describe the noun in bold, which means that we are going to choose an adjective, right? It says the train flies along the tracks. Is it the quick train or the quickly train flies along the track? All right. So if we were to select what kind of train, you see how I use what kind or how many, right? Because if we need to select an adjective, you need to ask yourself what kind or you ask yourself how many. If you cannot answer those two questions, then it means that it is not an adjective. So now we're going to ask what kind of train, right, flies along the track. Then we're going to say it's a quick train. So well done. Option one is correct. We need to choose again the best noun, right, to describe the noun. So which means that we're going to choose an adjective. Is Owen gladly to be on the new football team? Or is Owen glad to be on the new football team? Gladly or glad? Option one for gladly or option two for glad? All right, so if we were to choose the correct word, then we would say, is Owen glad to be on the new football team? So well done. Glad option two is correct. Mrs. Hoffman cares for her children. We need to describe the verb in bold. And if we describe the verb, then it means that we need to select the adverb, right? Remember, an adverb tells us about a verb. So if we're describing the verb, then it means that we need to choose the adverb. So it says Mrs. Hoffman cares, do we say greatly for her children? Or Mrs. Hoffman cares great for her children? Which one is correct? So we can say Mrs. Hoffman cares, and we're going to say greatly for her children. So great job. Greatly, it basically tells us how she cares for her children. Remember, we said an adverb that tells us how it ends in ly, like for example, greatly, safely, quickly. Keep your money in a, do we say in a safe place or keep your money in a safely place? We need to select and describe the noun. All right, so if we're describing a noun, it means that we need to select an adjective. So we say, keep your money in a, do we say in a safe place or in a safely place? All right. And then here it says, we said, keep your money in a safe, beautiful, in a safe place. All right, so well done. So safe place is correct. All right, let's do the last one of this and then we're going on to the next lesson. It says, choose the word that best describes the verb in bold. Sorry. The ladies smiled. Do they smile warm for pictures or warmly for pictures? All right, so we say that we need to describe the verb, which means that we need to select an adverb. The ladies smiled. Do we say smiled warm for the picture or the ladies smile warmly for the picture? Adverb. So we say that the ladies smiled. Do we say warm or warmly for the pictures? So in this case, we would say they smiled warmly because that is now also you asking yourself, how are they smiling, right? So they will say warmly. So well done. So we're now going to select the word if it's an adjective or is it an adverb. Once again, an adverb, it tells us more about a verb. All right. So if we were to once again also look at here where we need to select the adjective or the adverb, and then we will say that if we look at this word, it says Tracy easily climbed the oak tree. Climbed, right? Or easily climbed the oak tree. Is that an adjective or is that an adverb? So easily, is that an adjective or an adverb? So Tracy easily climbed the oak tree. So we will then say that easily is then an adverb, right? Because it's describing the noun or it's telling us about the noun climbed. The girls walk slowly through the field. So if we say here, the girls walk slowly through the field. If we ask ourselves, how did the girls walk? So you need to also ask yourself, how did the girls walk? And then we can say slowly, right? So slowly then becomes our adverb, right? Because it tells us about the verb, right? Yes, beautiful. Slowly is correct. So let's go to our test before we end our lesson. We need to say if the word in bold is either an adjective or an adverb. So now we are going to this question. It says, in the new family picture, Clayton smiled brightly. So smiled brightly, is this an adjective or an adverb? Smiled brightly. Look at the word that is underlined, right? The word that is underlined, you need to ask yourself, is that a noun or a verb? Something that someone is doing. Like if you're doing something, you're smiling. So which means that this smiled is a verb, which means that brightly is going to be an option two, right? Which is going to be an adverb. Guys, your first one was correct. That is why they are underlining the either the verb or the noun. So you're first going to identify the underlined word to say that, oh, okay, it's an adjective, it's a noun, which means it's going to be an adjective, or it's going to be it's a verb, so which means it's going to be an adverb. Justin bought a large pot for his plant. So a large pot for his plant. We need to say if large is an adjective or an adverb. So large pot, is that an adjective or is it an adverb? All right. Remember, pot is a noun. So if we were to describe that noun, right, and then we would say, what kind of pot? Remember, adjectives, we either ask ourselves what kind or we ask ourselves how many. So now we're asking ourselves, what kind of pot? And then you say it is a large pot. So it's an adjective. Well done. Option 1 is correct. Frank has 4 tickets to Sunday's game. Frank has 4 tickets to Sunday's game. Is this an adjective or an adverb? And look at this word. It says Frank has 4 tickets, right? Which means that 4 tells us how many, right? So how many tickets, right? And then that is an adjective. Remember, guys, remember, with an adjective, you need to ask yourself what kind, or you ask yourself how many. How many is a specific number, or several, or many, or lots, right? Whereas if you want to select an adverb, right, then you need to ask yourself how, when, or where, right? That is what you ask yourself. All right, so this is now the end of our lesson on adjectives and adverbs. We said an adjective, it tells us more about the noun, or we can say describes the noun, right? And usually we ask ourselves questions like what kind, or we ask ourselves how many. And then we have an adverb, right? And an adverb tells us more about the verb or describes the verb. And with an adverb, we need to ask ourselves questions like how, when, or where. All right, so that is now the end of our lesson on adjectives and adverbs. Thank you very much, grade twos, for joining the class, and I really hope you're going to have a good day further. Goodbye.